Hello, Darkness here. Before we begin, so obviously by now you probably know Anthony Center's being released. He's actually at a halfway house at this point. Now, I've heard rumors that aren't true about why Anthony's being released. First, I'm going to say he didn't help the authorities dig up any bodies. That's not why. And no, he didn't rat. They wouldn't have even tried to persuade him to cooperate anymore anyway, because everybody in that case is dead, incarcerated, or served a substantial amount of time and been released already. And they usually don't try to get you to cooperate after a certain point anyway, especially with his background. Anthony has remained firm about not snitching. He's been a model prisoner for 33 years. They said he's been a perfect prisoner in terms of doing everything he's supposed to do. Whether you agree about releasing him or don't agree, or whether I do or don't agree, or anybody else, doesn't matter. It is what it is. He's going to be released. A few months ago, I asked FBI agent Nelson, Walter Mack, and Detective Pergola, all of whom helped put him there, what they thought about Anthony being released. They didn't know at the time, and even Capici, I don't think, knew at the time. A federal attorney, Mack, and Capici have since investigated Anthony's release, and the answer is quite simple. Anthony Center's been a perfect, ideal prisoner for the last 30 years. Now, I'm going to read you some statements. These statements are coming directly from Detective Pergola and FBI agent Nelson, as well as Mac's response. And I'm also going to tell you what Robert DeMeo, whose brother Richie was killed by Anthony, and he was devastated by that, what they all think, and as well as what Walter Mack thinks. Then I'll give you my opinion on the matter and leave you to form your own. Responding to me in an email, Agent Anthony Nelson, prefers to be called FBI Agent Anthony Nelson. He loves the FBI, and he's very proud of his work, which I would be too. Anyway, I'm off topic. Read the question for your podcast and how I feel concerning Anthony Center's upcoming release from prison. It may be true, as you stated, that Anthony Center is now at low risk to society and has been in prison since Ghostbusters 2 was released. That's obviously responding to the things I said before. And you were only in your single digits when he went to prison. But he committed unforgivable crimes by human standards, crimes that many would believe were worthy of the death penalty. I'll let God, if he exists, decide if those crimes are forgivable in his eyes. I'm not a fan of the death penalty, but not because of moral issues. I've always believed that someone like Center would suffer much greater pain spending the rest of his life in prison, reflecting back in horrendous regret, and the pain he inflicted upon other people as well as himself. As I've told you before, neither I nor anyone else for the matter could possibly know for sure if an afterlife actually exists, so I've always been mindful that this may be the only world we will ever know. For that reason, I was glad that there had been some degree of justice and fairness meted out to Center and the remaining members of their DeMeo crew by having them spend the rest of their lives in prison without the possibility of parole. Obviously, there are some people who feel differently and believe that prison is simply a device for reform and not the dual purpose of punishment. So although I'm not happy about Center's release from a physical prison, I am confident he will remain confined to the prison and the regrets within him, without the possibility of release. Very poignant and well thought out statement from Agent Anthony Nelson. Frank Bergola, he's pissed about this. He says psychopaths don't change their spots any more than leopards do. I wrote Robert DeMeo. I was a little worried about how he'd feel about it. Richie's death almost killed Robert. When I asked him, he said, "No, not upset. It is what it is, and Quentin, I really fear no one. Fuck with my family, and I don't have to be gangster. It would come natural. I'll hit you up later." Now, Walter Mack and I agree that he's a low-risk reoffender, and so he's reformed in that sense, model prisoner. I suspect he is reformed and a very different person than he used to be, but I have to be a little bit agnostic or not, because I would like to talk to him in the future if I get a chance. So I suspect he probably is. He'd have to go through huge hurdles to get where he is, but I would be objective, in talking to him. And I believe that, now that he's free, before he's condemned, if he really is reformed, then I don't see any point of condemning anymore. That doesn't matter whether he should have gotten out or not. He is. Um, so he should be given a chance in society if he hasn't shown any acts of violence or anything. I've always thought Roy was a major problem for his behavior. Roy and Casso later on. Now, one last thing. Strong Island Finest, and I am really, really going to make a priority of thanking my fans who find some little small thing. There's so much information I'm dealing with here on top of this book now, which is coming along really, really well. I'm 4 out of 500 pages into it. Lots and lots of new information. If you think Roy, most of it's been covered, I'm sorry, I keep seeing the same things being told online and online, or by fakes by two people I'm not going to even name who are just making stuff up. That people have said, well, this is being so this has been done already. Hey, I'm the one who started it. I'm finishing my story, and I have tons of new information in my book. So they didn't do many of the hits. There is a lot. And so this is the complete story as I'm telling it. And I do the best I can to be accurate, and I correct myself if I get anything wrong. And Strong Island Finest here caught me. I accidentally put a picture up in which I confused Henry Brelli for one of Joey Testa's brothers. Duh, and I should have known that. Thank you so much, Strong Island Finest. You'll also get a thanks in the credits when the credits come up. So, anybody see something? Hey, look, my ego comes second to doing an accurate and good piece of work, the best piece of work I can do. Now, we can begin. Evening, Rikers Island, hospital ward. Nino Gaggi lounged back in his bed, the bullet still lodged in his neck, a bandage covering his collar. His doting wife Rose came in and embraced him, worried sick. His nephew Dominick Montiglio was with her. They had to prove that they were family in order to get in, show IDs, and so forth. There was a guard outside the hospital room. Nobody unrelated was getting through unless they worked there. By now, the authorities understood who Nino Gaggi was, thanks to FBI agent Anthony Nelson and Detective Kenny McCabe in their Veterans and Friends escapades. Not only did the authorities understand they were dealing with a high-ranking mob boss, a Gambino capo, they also knew Nino Gaggi just killed 2 people and tried to kill a cop. They just had to prove it to a jury, so they knew it too. So far, Nino had resisted surgery to have that bullet removed, which was lodged in his neck, and which cops would then be able to use to match the gun fired into Ippolito Jr. But it was only a matter of time. You see, the bullet would work itself out naturally through his skin. Your body tends to know when there's something intruding in on it, something that's not supposed to be there, and it begins to resist. And Nino, well, at this time he had the luck of the gods. You see, that bullet had not only missed his major artery, but it wasn't even deep enough to where the flesh couldn't take care of it itself. So that gave him time. So after Nino and Rosie embraced, oh dear, well, Dominic came over and gave his uncle a hug. And he left something in his palm. Here. Roy, well, he'd gone back for that gun that he had used to shoot Ippolito Sr. with, and he fired it into a pool of water, presumably a bathtub at the Gemini Lounge. Water's actually extremely resilient, and bullets start to slow down very quickly when fired in a liquid. Roy had reached down into the water, plucked the bullet up, and handed it to Dominic. Take this to him. And had Dominic smuggle the bullet to Nino with a condom that was bunched into the back of his mouth. Pretty smart. Nino then squeezed the actual bullet out of his neck and flushed it down the toilet and handed the guard Roy's bullet from a different gun. The same one, of course, that was used to fire at Ippolito Sr., as I said. So now it looks like he's been shot by the shooter, making him a victim, not the killer. But the feds are going to freak about this one. Yeah, well, you might ask, what about the 2 witnesses? They're still going to be a problem. When Joey and several others tried to bribe Officer Rodar, he told him, fuck off. He was both a dedicated cop and he was pissed off that Nino tried to kill him. So, you're not going to bribe this guy. And he began seeking protection because he knew that being a witness against a major organized crime figure was going to put him at serious risk. Then there was Patrick Penny, the hoodlum who decided to become a hero who had gotten involved. Well, he was being protected by cops. Now, everybody likes to hear a story about a guy who's just a total mess, who just doesn't have his shit together and hasn't shown his true potential, who suddenly does get his shit together, shows tremendous courage, and does something nobody else can or will do to make the world a better place. And you know what? History has such stories. Guy who just lives with his parents or is homeless, or maybe he's a drunk, or maybe he's an outright crook like Penny was, who burglarized houses. Either way, they make great stories. But Penny wasn't one of them. Unfortunately, his old self started to take over after that night, and once again, Penny decided to become dodgy, thinking, fuck being a hero. It just didn't sound as romantic as he dreamed it would be anymore. Well, so much for the new Penny. And so he sneaks out and runs away from the cops. But what he did was incredibly stupid. You see, once you try to come after Roy, or Nino, you have to commit yourself. Well, Nino was willing to bribe this Penny guy to shut him up, figuring he didn't know Nino any loyalties and it would look good if a witness didn't suddenly die. Well, Roy was less forgiving than Nino. He wasn't going to take a chance that he might decide to suddenly talk on the stand. Well, all this was going on, and Roy was dealing with Patrick Penny and Rodar. He had another issue, an older issue, that had been giving him problems for months. Khaled Daoud, he was going to testify. He made it clear that he's testifying against this illegal automotive operation, which would obviously affect Ustica and come right back to Roy. Now Roy's got to do something. So, Roy uses Freddy, who's now back. Freddy was part-time for years. He was still in the crew, but he was mostly doing his auto racing. But now he's back full-time, and his responsibilities are loan sharking, cars, and drug dealing. So he has Freddy entice Khaled Daoud to come over to his shop. So Freddy basically said, I have 2 Caprices that I'm looking to sell. Would you like to come see them? Yeah, sure. Caprices are a big thing. So Dowd calls back and he says, I'm going to be having a friend come with me. Freddy nods and he says, what are we supposed to do now? Roy looked at him like, are you an idiot, Freddy? We just shoot him and make them both disappear. Disappear? Vito was nearby. Yeah, cut him up. So Dowd and Falco drive over to Freddy's to take a look at this caprice, or these two caprices, rather. And when they arrive, Vito's there. He waves them on in, and Freddy takes them inside. As soon as the door closes behind them, it's completely dark. Freddy's like, let me find the light. Hold on. Stumbling around. Then all of a sudden, the room came to life through the sounds of semi-automatic gunfire and screams. Roy and Henry were on the other side, and they were holding semi-automatic guns and began firing into the men. One crumpled quickly. The other one turned and rammed the door that he had just come in, desperate to escape. Vito stood on the other side, all 300 pounds of him, trapping the dying man in. But that guy, whether it was Dowd or Falco, he managed to just get enough adrenaline going and hit it one time to where his fingers could reach through before he was pulled back with more shots. That was the end of him. When Vito finally peeked through to the other side, he saw Henry finishing off a round into Falco's head, who was lying on the ground. And while all this was going on, a dog started barking on the other side of the garage. It was Freddy's. I'm not sure if that's in Murder Machine or not, but they go into it in the court record like it's important. So next, Henry leaves. I'm out of here. I don't need this. He knows what's coming next, the dismemberment process. And the twins, they come in with knives. Now Freddy, he's never participated in dismemberment himself before, and he's a little grossed out at first, but then he's eager to prove himself to Roy. So he began chopping faster and working harder, and he starts chopping off too many pieces. At one point, Freddy severs Dowd's head, and then while the head's sitting there, he starts giggling and slices off Dowd's penis and shoves it into his mouth. Roy, he glances over curiously and then bellows laughter. Freddy, would you cut that out? You're crazy. But moments later, Roy's laughter would turn to aggravation and anger when Freddy sliced off an ear and then dropped it in a crack. Freddy, goddamn you! Cut it the fuck out! Now I'm still learning the details on this case, and I can only presume they retrieved Dowd's ear. So after the dismemberment's finished, now it's time to take it to Fountain Avenue. Well, Anthony, he has his cousin Dominic Vulpis, and despite Wiki, Center's cousin and his uncle were both Vulpises. They were not Centers, they were not Centes or Centes or anything like that. Vulpis. Dominic Vulpis was the cousin. His uncle was Anthony Vulpis. And the Vulpises were actually in a scandal a few years ago. They own the Canarsie Recycling Company, and they donated a few years ago to Eric Adams, which caused a stir because of their ties to the mob. And they were Roy's means of getting bodies to Fountain Avenue. Sometimes garbage men would come and they'd pick up the bodies, but often Anthony, he would go to a garbage truck and he would just drive the bodies in boxes there and then put them in different places in the meat part of the Fountain Avenue. So, now that October, Nino eventually made bail, because why not bail out a dangerous mobster who might try to bribe or kill one of your two witnesses you're trying to protect? But that's our court system for you. Justice is blind. Unless you have a good lawyer, then it's flexible. Now, during the last 3 years, Dominic, Henry, Matt Rega, and Dominic's friend and sidekick Buzzy were extorting clubs in the South Bronx and selling coke and quaaludes and robbing drug dealers. Eventually, they brought on board a woman named Cheryl Anderson, who was a bit of a psycho, I know from people who knew her, and she was also known as Cheryl the Quaalude Queen, because she got a lot of quaaludes from a pharmacist and helped sell them. So now she was an extra contact as well as Dom's mistress. even though she wasn't even half as attractive or classy as Dom's wife, Denise, but Dominic never minded fucking ugly when he was horny enough and drunk enough. Around this time, Dom would actually hammer his wood in pretty much anything so long as it looked like a woman and had a pulse. But need I say, none of this behavior was good for Dom. He was spending thousands a week on coke. Once he staggered in, having overdosed on blow, collapsed, and Uncle Nino had to call an ambulance to save his life. And for all of Nino's faults, he had a good reason to be pissed off at Dom. Dom was ruining his life, ruining his family, and Nino was showing that he cared. So on this matter, I completely side with Nino Gaggi. But unfortunately, over time, like many people who don't use but have to deal with somebody who's an addict, Nino became cynical and didn't really expect Dominic to ever change. And maybe he wouldn't. In the meantime, late into the year of 1979, Cheryl Anderson and Matt Rega were both arrested as part of a large sting operation. Cheryl had been getting her lewds from a crooked pharmacist, and Matty had been getting his lewds from Cheryl, and Dom, well, he had been getting his lewds from both of them, as well as other drugs. So, when he found out that Cheryl and Matty were both arrested, all Dominic could do was hope that these two would keep their fucking mouths shut and not snitch. Cheryl, well, she made bail, and she took off into the wind and went into hiding. So Dom couldn't be sure just how loyal this bitch would be at all. Now, Matty, he made bail, but as soon as he did, Nino and Roy called him in, and they demanded the $250,000 that Matty owed them. They didn't want Matty going to prison before paying them back their money.
Well, I only owe you guys $220,000. I gave your nephew Dominic $30,000 to give to you, Nino. If he didn't give it to you, I don't know what to say. Maybe he and his pal Henry took it and spent it on drugs or something,
Matty said. Roy and Nino looked at each other, and then Nino looked back at Matty and said,
I'll talk to Dominic and get back to you about that.
But you're still going to need to have the rest of the money ready, even if you're telling the truth. When Dominic heard that Matty was accusing him of having stolen $30,000 from Uncle Nino, Dominic was apoplectic.
Matty's a lying fucking weasel. I never stole anything from you, and I picked up millions for you over the years. That motherfucker just doesn't want to pay his debts.
Shut up. I believe you. You're a fuck-up, but I don't think you'd steal from me.
Still, there's gonna have to be a sit-down, and Paul's gonna have to get involved. You know Matty's dad is connected with another family. You two aren't gonna be able to be present in the first meeting. But don't worry, Paul likes you. He's known you forever.
Dominic felt irritated and alone. The harsh effects of cocaine were turning his fears into paranoia, and his irritation into irascibility. He snapped a lot more now. Dominic was just glad that Nino and Rose had purchased a home a few blocks away and were no longer living in the bunker. Nino had bought the place while he was still in the joint awaiting bail. Dominic was also having problems with Roy. Behind his back, Roy had begun telling Nino,
Your nephew's in really bad shape. He's fucking hookers all the time, dealing drugs with the Cubans.
Nino would later call Dominic and go off on him, and Dominic, fuming, would call Roy and go off on him.
Quit talking to my fucking uncle about me, Rooster.
Hey, we're just worried about you.
Bullshit. You're trying to turn him against me,
Dominic retorted. The two would argue furiously. Later, he would tell his wife or whoever was around,
Roy's really taking it to the limit with me.
Whether Roy had been just concerned or not, or just had a big mouth or not, Dominic was sure underneath it all that he was trying to turn Nino against him so he could kill him. Around this period, Dominic had been driving a snazzy Mercedes that Matt Rega, his former friend that he now loathed, had loaned him. And one day, Dominic went outside only to find that expensive Mercedes gone. Furiously, Dominic called Joey Testa. Although Joey and Anthony weren't really into car thieving, and of course they're not going to steal from Dominic in front of the bunker, they did know every degenerate from Canarsie, and that's where a lot of the car thieves came from. He figured that they would know who stole his Mercedes. Well, Joey talked to Anthony, and it turns out they did know who stole his Mercedes. They didn't know that they had stolen his Mercedes, but Joey and Anthony were able to locate the thieves. And the thieves, they sold it back to the twins for $500 to give back to Dominic. So when Joey and Anthony came over with the car, of course they wanted to be reimbursed for the $500 they paid to get it back.
Oh no, there's no fucking way. I'm not paying to have my car back after it was stolen. Hey, come on, man. We all take chances around here. They didn't know who the car belonged to, Joey said. And we had to pay to get it back for you, Anthony added. Yeah, well, I didn't tell you to do that. I wouldn't have paid those fucks a dime.
The twins grew red with anger, and they swung around and flounced away. Later, Roy called.
Hey, come on, the twins are upset. They said you did them a favor, you won't even pay them back for it. Fuck them. Their punk friends broke my window, and they fucked up the ignition. I'm not giving them a fucking dime. Hey, that's not Joey and Anthony's fault, Roy reasoned. Too bad. Now fuck off, Rooster.
Later, when Roy complained to Nino how Dominic was way out of line, Nino interrupted Roy flatly.
Dom's right. Those kids did fuck up. So that's all there is to say about that.
And that was the end of that incident. Over the next few weeks, though, the sit-down arrived. It was held at an Italian restaurant called Ruggiero's in Little Italy. Paul Castellano was there, Roy and Nino were there. Dominic was allowed to sit at a table nearby, but he wasn't allowed to be in on it. Matt Rega wouldn't be there at all. So at the meeting, Matty's father, who's connected with the Genovese, complained that Dominic didn't give money to his uncle, that he was supposed to give him. Uncle Nino. And elderly Rega also pointed out that Dominic's a junkie, a disgrace, always seen with hookers, that he's making everybody look bad, not like other mobsters aren't doing this, that other mobsters don't make themselves look bad, but that's another story. And then elderly Rega, who's obviously trying to get Dominic killed here, accused Dominic of selling heroin, and Dominic, up until the moment of his death a few years ago, says he never sold heroin. His best friend, Ross, said he never sold heroin. I believe he never sold heroin. But this is what Matty Rega told elderly Rega, or elderly Rega made up himself, one or the other, and that's what was then told to Paul. Now, dealing heroin is by far the worst allegation. Out of all the drugs you can deal, heroin is the worst. It's got very heavy penalties if you're caught dealing heroin. They will put you in prison for a long time. And one of the reasons why is it was probably the most destructive at that time, and it's still one of the most destructive. And it's also one of the most lucrative. It's actually more lucrative than cocaine. Pablo Escobar had a monopoly on heroin like he did coke, that guy would have had 4 times what he already had. Eddie Rendini, he was selling heroin at this time for Roy DeMeo. That was the guy that they had dealing their heroin. And they were working together with Salvatore Ruggiero over in Brooklyn. But in any event, Dominick Montiglio, up until his death, and his best friend says the same thing, Ross Brodar, he didn't deal heroin, and this Matty Rega elder was really looking to take Dominic down. But Paul ultimately sided with Dominic, even though he wasn't there. Nino was there, and Paul had been close to Dominic for a long time. And Paul said,
Dominic has issues he's gonna get help for, but I don't believe he deals heroin. No.
And that pretty much adjudicated that meeting. More were scheduled, including some where both Matty and Dominic would have faced off against each other, but that was all for that night. And then later, while Nino's discussing how the meeting went down with Dominic, Nino said,
You're lucky Paul likes you, and that you're my nephew.
To make sense of the next few days and how all this happened, you need to understand that Dominic is doing a lot of coke constantly. He is paranoid as paranoid can be. And Nino had been saying things like, I don't believe you anymore, Dominic. No, you lied to me too much. He's paranoid about Roy. Anytime Roy says anything behind his back, he feels like Roy's trying to get him killed. As Dominic and Nino are talking, Nino says, you do go up to the South Bronx a lot, which a lot of heroin dealing was going on there. And this just freaks Dominic out. Now, the next few days, he's still doing coke, and he's still experiencing the after effects of coke. He shows up a few times at Veterans and Friends. He sees his uncle, and his uncle says, and this is something he had said before, this is one of his uncle's favorite lines whenever Dominic had been vanishing a lot recently.
Well, what do you know? Lassie's come home.
And this stuck in Dominic's head. Now, I'm actually sympathetic with Nino during this period as far as Dominic's concerned. Dominic was out of control, and he was just cracking a joke here. But it got in Dominic's head, and he's like, he's going to end up doing a hit on me. He's thinks I'm nothing but a dog. This guy looks down on me. Part of that is Dominic looking down on himself. I'm sure Nino did look down on him, but Dominic was also looking down on himself. That's when Dominic decided he's going to leave. Later, Dominic tells his sidekick and fellow Fordham alumni, Buzzy, he's not going to deal with this. He's going to get clipped if he stays here in Brooklyn, or he's going to die of an overdose. It's time to start a new life, a fresh start over. And Buzzy had no problem with that, because Dominic's a wreck. His wife Denise was happy to hear Dominic just talk about changing back to the man that he used to be, the one that she loved so much. And so early in the morning, around 4 a.m., Dominic crept into the kitchen while Denise and the children are waiting outside in the car. He scribbles a note to his uncle, the details of which are now lost, mounted to something of some kind of apology with an explanation maybe that he was severing ties. And by the time Nino came over and read the letter, he was incensed with his nephew once again, and Dominic was driving Matt Rega's flashy car out of New York and off to California, which he stole from Matt Rega. I don't blame him. And it would have been nice to say Dominic was starting over, that he was headed off for a better life, but no. Dominic was just headed somewhere else to go fuck up his life and drag his family down with him. He'd continue dealing drugs in California, terrorizing people in California, just like he had been doing in New York. He wouldn't have Henry terrorizing people with him. Henry had no clue Dominic was leaving, and he was upset that his best friend suddenly vanished in the wind. But then that's going to be the least of Henry's problems coming up. In the meantime, Nino's enraged that Dominic just fled like that, especially after all the meetings they had planned together with Paul and Maddie. It was stress he didn't need with his trial coming up. Roy's still trying to reach out to this Penny, but Penny's not easy to get to, and cops are watching Penny all the time. So Roy and Nino begin planning to find somebody on the jury to get Nino off, and Roy's going to use one of his contacts for that. But as far as the situation, things are never going to be the same. Dominic was gone, and the investigators were watching one of Roy's garages on Empire Boulevard, noticing the bizarre activity that was going on there. Informants had begun telling John Murphy about the terrible murders revolving around Roy's crew, although Murphy didn't know who Roy was just yet. It was going to take a brilliant prosecutor, Walter Mack, from the Second Circuit to bridge the gap between McCabe and Anthony's intelligence and John Murphy and his partners, Harry Brady. The 1980s were arriving now. For many, it would mean Ronald Reagan, VCRs, MTV, and wild hairstyles. For Roy, it would mean helicopters, wiretappings, a joint task force, snitches, and an angry Paul and Nino, with more murders as Roy saw enemies everywhere.